Hello, my name is Scuria-Herman, and today I will be speaking on the topic of naming. Now, naming is in fact on this list of ideas, but the thing is, I was going to do it eventually anyway, but a few classes ago, after I had written my last video on the topic of the flaws of diversity in media, the topic of naming actually came up naturally. So it was very convenient, and I'm going to talk more extensively on it here. What do I mean when I say topic of naming? Well, I'm a writer, as some of you may know. And one of the most core parts when reading a book is knowing which character is who, and how do you do that? By names, unless you're doing something really inventive or experimental and trying to give your characters only titles or pronouns, which I have seen. I have seen characters solely go by pronouns and not proper nouns. It's definitely a choice. In how I've seen it implemented, it actually worked really well because of the emphasis given on he or she in the story, and it does like stand out and differentiate. But that's besides the point. That's on the topic of pronouns. When people play around with pronouns like that, I do like it, at least in what I've gone out of my way to see so far, but that's besides the point. On the topic of names or proper nouns, in my opinion, obviously this is my channel, this is my opinion. In my opinion, if you are naming a character something meaningful, you're doing it wrong. A character's name should have little to no meaning. Here's what I mean by that. If you name a character who has all this stuff to do with like fire, if you name him like, I don't know, what's a fire name? Festus, right? If you name a character who's all about fire, who's an arsonist, but he chose that path, like eventually he sought out and chose that path, and he didn't change his name to Festus. If he was born Festus and then halfway through his life he was like, you know what, I want to go burn down some buildings, that's a bad character name. Because why are you naming him Festus when his father is Charles and his mother is Martha? You see what I mean? A character's name should make sense in the world, unless he changed the name to Festus. He's like really obsessed with fire, so much so that he's like, I'm gonna be fire, I'm gonna be Festus. If that's the case, then sure. But a lot of the time, people don't do that. Both in real life, obviously it's becoming more important and common nowadays in real life, but in works of fiction it doesn't happen so much because you want to keep a character's name consistent, and if you're going to make a character a specific way, usually the name is the first thing that changes, and that happens before the events of a book. Regardless of that fact, Festus would not be a good name. You want to know why? Because a name, this is what I said in the class, a name does not characterize the character, it characterizes their parents. Festus, if it doesn't say anything about Martha or Charles, it's not a good name. Because why would Martha or Charles pick Festus? Festus might pick Festus, but Festus didn't pick his name. I didn't pick Daniel. Daniel says something about my parents because I have a relative who died right before I was born named Daniel. So I'm Daniel. That says nothing about me. That says something about those who came before. That's how you characterize somebody. Why am I named Daniel? Because of that. There's an exterior reason beyond myself. I don't think Daniel has anything to say about me. I don't think anything about me is Daniel besides the fact that it is my name. And like, at the end of the day, I'm not going to change my name. There's no name that speaks to me more than Daniel because that's all I've ever known. I am Daniel. But that's not necessarily something that's in and of itself explanatory of me and my being. It's just who I am. Just like Festus is Festus if his father was Epiphanius and his mother was, I don't know, Esmeralda. A name like Festus would make more sense then. But Martha and Charles wouldn't have a Festus. Unless Martha and Charles are really obsessed with something that has to do with Festus. You see what I'm saying? The example I used in class, the real example, Festus isn't a real person. Obviously, these characters aren't real either. They're characters, but they're not. Festus isn't a real character, I guess? I don't know. you should understand what I mean. But so someone was like debating like how to name a character, and I think it was someone who was like Mexican in the story, and then the person gave her like a Persian name, and the person who wrote it was Persian. They weren't trying to like, it wasn't, you know, it was just unconscious, and that spawned a conversation about names and how you should name a character. People didn't really know what to say about that, so they turned to me because I had already presented my story the week before. This is the story that I showed the snippet of on the topic of free indirect style. But that story, the characters in that part are Carl, who was in the free indirect style video, indirectly, and Engo. Now, Carl and Engo, they come from two very different backgrounds. Engo is from New York. He's from the Upper East Side. Carl is from New Mexico. He's from Albuquerque. Two very different characters. There's a whole thing with Carl going on. That isn't the part I went through. Carl has a very distinct family line that has very specific reasons for their names, because Carl's father is Cody, Cody's father is Chris, Chris's father is Conrad, and so on. There's a reason why he's named Carl, and that's because of his family lineage, and they all have reasons why they picked that name for their son. So that's all of Carl's backstory. Engo's backstory is much more interesting because Engo isn't a common name. It's definitely not as common a name as Carl. How do you get the name Engo? How do you arrive at that? Well, Engo's race, which is rare for my characters, has a lot to do with how he's named. Because Carl, at the end of the day, in my mind, he is white, but it doesn't really matter what I mean, there's very little that you can do to separate race from Carl, because he's a white guy with red hair in Albuquerque. The white isn't never really said, but with everything else, it's kind of hard to avoid. But the race doesn't really play an impact on his characterization. The race for Engo, who's also white, does play an impact. How do you get to Engo? Engo comes from a wealthy family. His parents, they're very rich and they travel a lot and they want to feel more worldly. They're that kind of white people. They want to feel more worldly and they want to travel the world and experience all of it so they can, you know, be cultured, and they collect like artifacts from across the world. Because of course they do. They're of like French ancestry. Engo is not a French name. They didn't want to give him a French name. They wanted to give him a creative, special name that only he would have. So in their travels, poverty tourism, they go to Africa a lot. They picked a name that's more common in the Ivory Coast, Engo. And it's a different spelling of it too. It's a less common spelling of it because obviously it would be like Ingo, and he's just a white guy. And they want to make him seem more cultured because of that. That plays a lot into how his perspective is formed from his parents. Engo as a name and the meaning of the name has very little impact on the character itself, but the meaning of why he was given that name plays a lot on the character because it comes from a place of privilege, and that plays on that. And he feels like he should participate in areas that he shouldn't because of that name. Not because of their name directly, but because of their name indirectly, because of how his parents treated him growing up. And that's why he thinks he should just be able to have everything. And that's why he has this everybody in the class called him narcissistic. I'm not going to really try to dissuade them from that point. But you see, all of it stems from the name, but it also doesn't. Because Engo doesn't say anything about Engo. Engo says things about his parents, which in turn imposed things onto Engo. That's why names are important, but they're also equally unimportant for that reason. But yeah, when naming a character, you should focus on what that name means in context of how they were brought up. For Engo, that was obvious in what I just described, but if Martha and Charles had a very big interaction with a Festus, or with a relative named Festus, like not just a stranger or a relative, like with me, with Daniel, if that was a big thing with them, then Festus makes sense. Okay, at this point, I'm just rambling, so I'm gonna call it there. But anyway, that's gonna be it for me. So until next time, adieu.